Kim Lee lived alone in the outer suburbs of Sydney. She was visited regularly by Frank, a community support worker who cleaned and checked up on her. Kim Lee had limited English and wasn't leaving the house very often because she was nervous about conversing with locals in her area. Frank also gradually realised that she did not want to be reconnected with a Vietnamese community because of past trauma which she had experienced. Frank was at a bit of a loss. He found it hard to have deep conversations with Kim Lee, but really wanted to get to know her and her family history. He would sit for hours looking at old photos with her, and he would bring photos of his family as they shared stilted stories and made up lots of hand gestures in order to make themselves understood. One day Frank noticed that Kim Lee had many old rock and roll records and an old record player. He asked if he could play one, and Kim Lee smiled and tapped her feet to the music. She was happy and transformed by the music of Elvis, the Beatles and other early rock and roll greats. He found out that she had listened to this music since she had migrated to Australia, and it was very precious to her. Kim Lee was in her late 70s and was still quite fit and active. Frank did some research and discovered that there was a swing dancing group that met weekly in the suburb that Kim Lee lived. He invited her to come with him one week, and they had a wonderful time dancing and laughing together. Many older community members were also there, and there was a chance for Kim Lee to meet many neighbours over coffee and cake that night. She went back week after week, danced, made friends and shared food with them. These friends invited Kim Lee into their homes, and her English improved from being with her new friends. It was a shared love of music and dance that brought these community members together. Frank's persistence in linking Kim Lee to her passion meant that she was connected to a whole new community. For organisations to be able to assist older people to have life-giving experiences, they need to be flexible in how they engage and support people and their communities. Rodney did not need the same service that everyone else received. He needed Maria to have a conversation about what was important to him. In contrast, Frank was able to be much more flexible in how he supported Kim Lee. Organisations need to support volunteers and citizens, value stories and direct experience. Preference familiarity over a professional aura. Staff need to be seen as brokers and facilitators. People who are supported by services need to be seen as citizens, members and contributors, rather than clients, consumers or customers.
It would be worthwhile now to have a conversation with at least one other person about how your organisation, association or church can move forward towards becoming more associational. Remember, dare to start small. Many great changes have started from very small beginnings. This resource has been funded by the Minister for Ageing with a particular interest in supporting socially isolated older members of the community. A question that many people have been asking is, how do we find older people in our community? We've learnt from these workshops that every community has a different set of assets, relationships and connection points. The way to find older people in a community is to know your community. It's to loiter with intent. Take some time now to quickly brainstorm all the places that you might be able to make contact with socially isolated older members of your community. How'd you go? In my experience, people who spend time in community or work with older people actually know the answer to this question. Here are a few of the places and ways that other groups have listed.
Shops, banks, doctors' surgeries, corner stores, chemists, services such as home care, handy people, gardeners, other older people's organisations, senior cits associations, funeral directors, ministers of religion, postal delivery people, connector leaders, aged care services, libraries, government services like Centrelink.
Did you think of some new ones? Because I'm sure there are countless more. One great way of finding older isolated people is to go to organisations and ask, who used to be here, who isn't here now, who used to come to church or bowls or senior citizens, and how can we re-engage them? This can be a slow process and sometimes deceptively simple. Claudia, for example, owned a fruit shop. A number of older women used to buy their fruit there. It seemed to Claudia that this was one of the very few times these women came out of their home. She simply put a couple of chairs out the front of the shop and invited the women to sit down and talk. Over time, the small group started to meet and have tea at the fruit shop every Wednesday afternoon. Does anyone in your group have a story to share? One of the things we've learned through conducting this workshop so many times is that the most successful outcomes come when people start to implement at least one thing that they've discovered. People have done very different things. Some have kept meeting and talking about what matters. Others have started learning conversations with older people in their community. Others have brought together connected leaders to explore how they could connect with the strangers in their midst. Church congregations have started to notice who used to be there but isn't there now. Who comes to church yet nobody knows them. Organisations have started to change their intake processes, moving from just talking about needs to also talking about assets. One organisation is now at the beginning of its weekly meeting simply asking, what worked this week? Another has done the head, heart and hand exercise with all its staff. And finally, one organisation has asked its staff to make a contact with one new person or group every week. The most important thing to do is to get started, to prototype, because these are the runways of the future. Spend time now, individually or as a group, thinking about what you might do differently in your journey to help older people come into community. Thank you for being part of this important journey. We invite you to continue being part of this important conversation because together we're better. As my colleague Mike Green said beautifully, when people discover what they have, they find power. When people join together and new connections and relationships, they build power. When people become more productive together, they exercise their power to address problems and realise dreams.